Okay, one quick note. This actually came from a question between the sessions. Just because Luther and Zwingli and probably a lot of the other reformers thought that if you got communion wrong, you weren't in a real church, doesn't mean we have to believe that. Okay. I think that the important thing here is to recognize that communion is something really important, that something really happens in communion, and that we're not likely to actually be able to grasp everything that's going on in it. And that's okay. This is one of the places where I will disagree with them. Okay. There's a mystery involved here, and we have to be good with mystery. So I think I need to throw that in, because going in that direction just leads you, I would argue, leads you into bad places, putting too much of an emphasis on getting it right. Okay, so with that, let's look at what's happened since the Reformation. You know, the medieval lecture, I had about 30 seconds per decade. The last one, I was doing a bit better. I had more time, but now I'm back to a minute per decade. So we're going to go through this kind of fast. What we're going to look at here are the trends that are happening after the Reformation and how the church interacted with those. One of the themes that I always emphasize when I'm doing church history classes is that whatever else the church may be, it's a human institution and it exists inside society. Now, we can accept that the church is the body of Christ. We can accept that, you know, the Holy Spirit dwells in the church and all of that. But the church is made up of people, and those people are invariably shaped by society. So what's going on in the society as a whole always affects the church. Now, this isn't a theme I've been able to develop a lot prior to this, but it's important to understand that as we're moving, especially in this last section, from about 1600 to the present. Okay, so what's going on in Europe? Intellectually, the world is moving increasingly toward rationalism on the one hand and empiricism on the other. Okay, what's the difference? Empiricism is learning about the world, for example, using the scientific method. You gather evidence, you make observations of the world, and you draw conclusions based on that. Rationalism, technically, is the use of reason to think your way through things. Doesn't necessarily rely on evidence. The classic example of a rationalist is Descartes, who says, you know, all right, people get Descartes wrong all the time. Let me just note that. In Descartes' case, one of the intellectual trends that occurred during the 16th century, because they're busy trying to recover all kinds of ancient texts, this is the effect of the Renaissance, is they uncovered a skeptic by the name of Pyrrho. Pyrrho is an ancient Greek. He actually went with Alexander the Great to India and came back. And after being in India, he came back a thoroughgoing skeptic. And we know about Pyrrho through a Roman writer named Sextus Empiricus, who was recovered during the middle of the 16th century. And Pyrrhonism is, you know, I teach Pyrrhonism in my classes, or at least I used to. And when I mentioned this to one of the head of the philosophy department, he laughed and said, you know, we don't tell our students about Pyrrho until they're seniors, because if we did, we'd lose all of our majors. Okay, Pyrrhonism is less a kind of thought as it is a methodology, and it acts like an acid that destroys certainty. Okay, so, all right, we've got a lot of parents here. What is the most dreaded word in a toddler's vocabulary? Why? Pyrrho was the toddler from hell. Okay. You make any kind of statement, and Pyrrho would say, okay, why is that true? How do you know that? Where does that come from? And he'd keep going until, like a parent, you have to say, because. Okay. Now, remember the medieval concept of truth. It's coming back here. The medieval concept of truth is that truth is an absolute, that it's possible to know absolute truth, and in fact, you must know absolute truth, at least to a certain degree, for society to function right. Pyrrho comes along, and his methodology is systematically designed to destroy certainty. And what you've just done is you pulled the rug out of the way everybody thinks about truth, everybody thinks about knowledge. What's your foundation anymore? That's the context of Descartes. Descartes was trying to answer Pyrrho. Pyrrhonical skepticism is about systematic doubt to destroy certainty. So Descartes, operating in the old paradigm, knowledge must be certain, says, okay, what is there that I can't doubt? Well, the one thing that I can't doubt is that I can doubt. Okay? I can think. And the fact that this thinking is occurring means that something must exist that is doing the thinking. And he summarizes this with the phrase, I think, therefore I am. Okay. This is not intended to be Descartes saying, everything starts with me. Everything starts with my thinking. This is a response to Pyrrho. It is a response to this kind of skepticism that has infected Europe, and that is really a very serious problem for the European mind. Now, it's worth noting Descartes goes on from there to say, okay, I exist. I can conceive of God. I can conceive of God, but there's nothing that I have encountered in the world that is like God. God is above and beyond. The God I conceive of is above and beyond everything that I can see or experience in the world. So where did I get this idea of this transcendent being? The only place that idea could have come from is that transcendent being. So therefore, God must exist as well. That's the next step in Pyrrho's argument. Descartes' argument, thank you. From there, then he makes the fatal step. He says, okay, if God exists, or since God exists, God must guarantee that clear and distinct ideas are true. He sees God very much in sort of a Platonic framework in this realm of ideas. So God's existence guarantees the authority of clear and distinct ideas. And once Descartes has that, it's off to the races. Because anything Descartes claims to be a clear and distinct idea is therefore must be true by the existence of God. And so he develops this entire deductive system to try to explain everything that exists. And he's wrong about most of it. Okay. On the other hand, so that's rationalism. On the other hand, you have empiricism. Empiricism says, human reason, whatever. Pyrrho, I don't care. I see things here. These things are happening, and because these things are happening, I can conclude that this is what's going on. Now, the problem with empiricism is that, well, let's say you run into a large white water bird, and you say, okay, that's a swan. You run into another swan, and it's a large white water bird. You run into another swan, and it's a large white water bird. So you conclude that swans are large white water birds. And then you go to Australia and see a black swan. The problem is empiricism doesn't give you certain conclusions. Empiricism in terms of absolute knowledge isn't entitled to its conclusions, whereas rationalism, deductivism, isn't really, in terms of certainty, entitled to its premises. So you got a problem either way. So how do you solve this problem? Along comes a guy by the name of Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal was a French Jansenist, a reform-minded Catholic, serious believer, a philosopher, mathematician, physicist, all kinds of different things. And Pascal, so Descartes says that by clear and distinct ideas, I know that vacuums are impossible. How do I know that? Because matter, by Descartes' definition, is extension. Matter is anything that takes up space. So if you've got space, you must have matter, period. There's another guy by the name of Gassendi who's influenced by Heraclitus and early Greek philosophers, and he believes in atoms, and he argues everything is atoms and the empty space between atoms. So for Gassendi, a vacuum is obviously possible. For Descartes, it is by definition impossible. So what Pascal does is he takes a barometer. Now, in a barometer, the basic way you make a barometer is you fill a tube with a liquid. We use mercury because of the weight, it's easier. You fill a tube with mercury, you put your finger on the end of it, you put it in a bowl of mercury, and you take your finger away. And some of the mercury will drop down, and then the measure from the top of the mercury there is your barometric pressure. Okay, so that's how it works. The question is, what is in this space above the mercury? You've got this empty space there where it's dropped. What's there? Descartes says, well, it's got to be matter. So you must have small particles of matter that boil off the glass on the sides and fill this up. Gassendi says, it's a vacuum. How do you solve the problem? Pascal takes a barometer, measures the pressure at ground level, and on a clear day, they know barometric pressure changes with weather. So on a clear day, he does this. Then he takes it up to the top of a mountain, and he notices that the barometric pressure drops. Then he brings it back down, and it goes back up. His conclusion is the most likely explanation for this behavior, which would be predicted by Gassendi, is Gassendi's, that this is in fact a vacuum. Is this 100% conclusive proof? No. But you know what? It's good enough. It is most probably correct. And as a result, you get this development of an idea called probabilism. Probabilism says that knowledge can be based not on certainty, but on probability. The most probable answer is the one that's, yeah, it's good enough. We can go with that. If we're proven wrong later, oh well, we'll adjust. Okay. So the definition of knowledge changes at this point. Pascal's idea pulls the rug out from under Pirot. Because Pirot is all about certainty. Pascal says, who cares? You know, this is good enough. So you begin getting this idea of probability as the foundation for knowledge. Absolute certainty, no longer necessary for it to qualify as knowledge. Now, Pascal is a Christian, but this is going to have long-standing impact on, in some negative ways actually, on intellectual development. But what comes out of this is an idea that didn't exist prior to this. It's the idea of progress. Because you see, if knowledge is based on probability, we can learn more based on what we think, what we consider knowledge now. We can develop it further. We can learn more, and our knowledge can constantly be improving. It can constantly be getting better. This doesn't mean we reject all the stuff from the ancient world. There were some really smart guys there. We can study them, but we don't have to hold them as absolute authorities the way they did in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. We pay attention to them, we learn from them and all that, but we build on them. And as a result, progress becomes possible. And we begin getting this ideology of progress that, unlike the Middle Ages, unlike the Renaissance, unlike the Reformation, we're not looking to the past for truth, we're looking to the present, or better yet, the future. So we have this idea of progress. Things are going to get better. And this becomes deeply embedded in the European mind. And this is going to move forward into what we euphemistically, I would say, call the Enlightenment. Okay? In the Enlightenment, you have a growing emphasis particularly on reason and a growing de-emphasis on Christianity, especially in France, which is really the center of Enlightenment culture in a lot of ways. England plays by different rules. Germany's slightly different. Germany's more like France. But particularly within the French Enlightenment, you have a strong anti-Christian element that begins to work its way in. Christianity is seen as unreasonable, and more to the point, the Catholic Church in France was deeply intertwined with the culture and with the monarchy. And France was desperately in need of reform, but there was no way to do reform without getting rid of the church because it was so deeply interconnected with everything. So you get French Enlightenment thinkers who say that the reform will not be complete until the last king is strangled with the guts of the last priest. You get really vicious kinds of rhetoric like this. The Enlightenment thinkers were, they call them philosophes, which is a French word meaning philosopher. They weren't philosophers. They called themselves philosophers. What they really were social critics, okay? And they believed that you should use reason and all of this to devise better ways of doing society, and then you should put these ideas in practice to see if they actually worked, and then improve from there. They believed that you could use reason, you could reason your way to a better world if you applied it. And this is going to be a growing ideology, especially in France, and that's ultimately going to feed into the revolution. Now, as you're getting this growing movement toward reason, and in Britain especially empiricism and such, there's something else going on, though, that is really rather interesting. You see reason being used in theology increasingly. The Protestants are developing their confessions of faith. They're doing systematic theologies and all of this kind of thing. Unfortunately, many of these confessions of faith are designed to divide them from other Protestant bodies, to define how we're different from them. But that's what they're doing. So they're using reason to develop their theologies, at first generally pretty orthodox theologies. But there's a counter movement that's going on as well. In Germany, it's called pietism. The pietists say, this theological hair splitting isn't really what the faith is about. What the faith is about is a warm personal experience of God. And so you get this sort of pietistic movement floating around in Germany. In France, the Jansenists are a conservative, almost Calvinist attempt to reform the Catholic Church, right in the face of what's going on in the early Enlightenment in Louis XIV's court. In England, I wasn't able to do the English Reformation, but in England you have the Reformation that takes place, then the king, you get this uneasy settlement under Elizabeth where they want to have sort of a moderate Calvinist theology, but Catholic style ceremonial. All the smells and bells and vestments and all those kinds of things, which the Calvinists don't really like, especially in Scotland. Then the king tries to impose this on the Scots. The Scots do what the Scots do. They went to war with the English. And Parliament ends up joining the Scots. You get the English Civil War. The king is defeated and beheaded. You get this period of the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector. When he dies, his son's incompetent, and they bring back the king's sons with the restoration of the Stuart monarchy. Now, with the restoration, what happens in England is people are really sick and tired, frankly, of fighting over religion. And they are also very desperately afraid that anyone who gets too serious about their faith could destabilize the country again. So the net result is through the late 17th and 18th century, what you get in England is a sense that, okay, you need to be a member of the church. You need to be baptized as a baby. You need to be confirmed. You need to do communion. You need to get married in the church. When you die, you need to have a church funeral and be buried in the church. But that's it. Anything more than that, any more engagement with religion is dangerous. In fact, and this has to be said with a sneer in your voice, in fact, if you do that, it smacks of enthusiasm. And that's a dirty word in England. It's sort of like calling somebody a holy roller or something like that here. So England has this very dead church spiritually. But what happens? In Wales, you start getting a revival among the Calvinists in Wales. Wesley and his associates, George Whitefield, begin a revival starting in Oxford, actually, but then passing out. They're not welcome in churches, so they preach outdoors. And they're preaching to the poor, and people are coming to faith in droves. You get these kinds of things happening in Scotland. Actually, in Scotland, the revivals are frequently associated with communion. There'll be times when there'll be special communion services where everybody will come together and they'll be preaching over several days and things like that. And you get revivals breaking out in conjunction with the Lord's Supper. You get all kinds of things going on. And then across the pond over here, we have the Great Awakening happening. Starting, interestingly enough, with a Dutch Reformed church, a guy by the name of Frelinghuysen in New Jersey, and then spreading into New England with Jonathan Edwards and all the other preachers. The Great Awakening, by the way, is an important element that leads to the American Revolution. Why? Well, because simply there are tracts that go around about the dangers of an unconverted clergy. And the sense is that a common plowboy with his Bible who has had a conversion experience is actually the spiritual superior to a bishop that hasn't. This creates this sort of anti-hierarchical attitude, which then allows you to question whether we really need a king. So the Great Awakening actually provides some of the intellectual context for the American Revolution. But the point here is that when we look at intellectual, oh, and by the way, let me add one thing. Jonathan Edwards is arguably the greatest intellectual America ever produced. And this isn't just me as a Christian saying this. There are a lot of secular authors who will say exactly the same thing. He was absolutely brilliant. Okay, so what we see when we look at your normal history of Europe is, yeah, you get this Enlightenment and it's anti-Christian and all of that kind of thing, and that leads to the French Revolution and so on. They completely ignore the fact that there's this counter movement going on all the way through in the form of various kinds, well, Pietism, Jansenism, and the evangelical awakenings, the evangelical revivals in Britain and in the New World. This is something that is a constant that is happening as a counter trend to what you're seeing in the Enlightenment. Okay. Now, the revivals are going to continue into the 19th century. In the 19th century, you get the Second Great Awakening, which has some pluses and some minuses. I would argue that the invention of the altar call at that place, which again replaces communion typically, is a major problem. And you get all kinds of heretical sects coming out of it, but there are some positive things that are going on as well. But the 19th century sees an important change. You get the chaos of the French Revolution, which has important implications for political theory, which I can't get into here. If you're interested in that, Slaying Leviathan's epilogue covers that. But there's a shift away from the idea of the Enlightenment as the age of reason. There's a shift away from the emphasis on reason, that we can think our way to new solutions, to an emphasis on hardcore empiricism, just the sciences. And in fact, the word science itself is an interesting example of this. When we use the word science, we know what we mean. It's studies of the natural world and maybe some other things. You got the fuzzy sciences like sociology and stuff, but it's generally this set of disciplines like chemistry, physics, biology, and so on. The word science, which comes from the Latin word scientia, originally simply meant any field of knowledge that has some sort of methodology attached to it, how you actually do it. Thus, in the Middle Ages, theology was considered the queen of the sciences. It's the one that structures everything else under it. Theology was legitimately considered a science by the old definition. When you get to the 19th century, the definition of science changes. Science gets reduced to things that are empirically verifiable. Empiricism wins. And thus, the only thing that qualifies anymore as knowledge is empirical knowledge or things that are logically necessary following from that, like mathematics or whatever. Okay. This is a marked change from even the late 1700s. In the Enlightenment, the premier, what we would call scientific society, is the Royal Philosophical Society of London. The Royal Philosophical Society is called the Royal Philosophical Society because it was dealing with what was called then natural philosophy. We call it science. When you read the transactions of the Royal Philosophical Society into maybe the first years of the 1800s, what you will see are scientific studies. You'll get the empirical stuff, you'll get the experiments and all that, and they will present their conclusions. But after they present their conclusions about the science, they will point out the moral and spiritual implications of what it is that they found in the natural world. They had this integrated vision of the invisible and the visible, the upper and lower story, as Schaeffer would say. They believed that the things that God put in the natural world pointed beyond themselves. So as we study the natural world, it reveals more of the mind of God, and that in turn has moral and spiritual implications. This is all through the transactions of the Royal Philosophical Society until the 19th century. In the 19th century, all of that vanishes. And science becomes, strictly speaking, what's going on in the natural world. And remember, the word science really simply means knowledge. Anything that you can't empirically verify or isn't logically necessary is no longer qualifies as knowledge. And this is the origin of that fact-value distinction I talked about a couple of talks ago, where knowledge is limited to what goes on in the lower story here. Everything in the upper story, aesthetics, morality, ethics, religion, all of those kinds of things, those are not matters of knowledge. They're matters of opinion, they're matters of faith, they're matters of taste, but they don't qualify as knowledge. They don't qualify as fact. Okay. This leads to an epistemological system, a system of knowledge called scientism. What scientism says is that any scientific, physical, empirical explanation of something, no matter how improbable it may be, is always superior to an appeal to something outside of the physical realm. In other words, no matter how improbable something is, you've got to accept a scientific explanation for it rather than saying it's something that transcends science. Thus, for example, when you fall in love with someone, what is happening is pheromones. What is happening is there are molecules that are being released into your bloodstream that are making you feel a certain kind of way. You're getting hormones released and stuff like that. And falling in love is really a matter of simple biology. It has nothing to do with anything beyond that. Now, if you believe that, I feel sorry for you. But scientism demands that the explanation go that way, because science is the supreme source of knowledge, and every phenomenon has to be explained strictly in terms of scientific fact. Okay. Now, along with this, you have the sense, actually going all the way back to the 17th century, you get the sense that the purpose of science is to dominate the world and to use it for our purposes. So you get the development of technology. You see the Industrial Revolution starting in the 18th century, going roaring ahead in the 19th century, and so on. And all of this is combined with the idea of progress. Meanwhile, we're left in a situation where Christians are left scratching their head. You do continue, especially in America, to have these revivals, but how do Christians function in a world like this? Well, you begin developing what's known as liberal theology, okay, as a response to modernity. And liberal theology begins with a guy by the name of Friedrich Daniel Ernst Schleiermacher. Okay, let's just call him Schleiermacher. He's trying to deal with this situation, and what he says is, okay, you know, you guys, you can have the science. You've got your explanations in the natural world, and that's good. But the fact of the matter that isn't really the only kind of knowledge that's out there. There's a kind of knowledge that religion gives that is non-empirical and all that, that's more intuitive. It provides you with emotional experiences and things like that that are valid. So Schleiermacher's argument is religion is valid because basically it makes you feel good. You get these experiences and stuff like that. So it's all about the experiential side, nothing factual about it. It's all experience. It's all upper story. That's Schleiermacher. You get other people, in America particularly, you get a movement known as the social gospel. Well, Christianity is good because it provides you with a set of ethics that gives you incentive to fix social problems. Yeah, because problems, everybody knows there are problems in society and we need to fix those. It's not so much about fixing the problems in the person. It's not really about personal salvation. It's about social action. Okay, so you get that. You also, in the midst of all of this, are getting the rise of biblical criticism where they're busy trying to dismantle the Bible, say the Bible isn't really inspired. We know the Bible can't be inspired because, number one, that would require non-empirical knowledge, which is by definition impossible. If God is revealing something, that's not empirical, it doesn't really qualify as knowledge. Further, it talks about miracles, and we all know miracles can't happen. Science proves that. So we've got to get rid of the miracles. Oh, by the way, that also means we've got to get rid of the incarnation. You remember the Christological debates we talked about in the first talk? They're back. All of these kinds of things happen. And so the liberal theologians, one of the things they'll do is they'll look at the Bible and they'll say, all right, these aren't, the 5 books of Moses, this is where it starts. The 5 books of Moses weren't really written by Moses. And there are all kinds of ideas about this in the 17th century moving on. But ultimately, it gets, and this is still doctrine in a lot of theological schools, ultimately they argue that there are 4 different traditions here, labeled J, E, D, and P, that you can break up the 5 books of Moses and tell which tradition the different pieces came from, and they were all just sort of edited together. That's the argument. And it's based on things like different uses of the name of God. So the J source, J in German is pronounced like Y. So the J source, whenever the Old Testament or whenever the Pentateuch talks about Yahweh, that's the J source. When they use the word Elohim, God, that's the E source, J-E, okay? The D is the Deuteronomic. There's a lot of repetitions, and that all gets thrown in the Deuteronomic. P is the priestly source. It deals with all the things dealing with the priestly code and so on. And so this wasn't really composed by Moses. It's all these different documents that have been kludged together. That's the argument. I would challenge them to apply those principles to the Lord of the Rings. How many names does Aragorn have? For those of you who have read it. This proves conclusively that Tolkien wasn't a single author. There must have been several of them because he uses different names. Again, my brilliant daughter Elizabeth, I made this point to her and she ended up writing an essay in which she absolutely shreds the documentary hypothesis, applying it to the Lord of the Rings, and it is, again, one of these very, very funny things. But in any event, all of these things are coming in. Why? Because the mindset of the culture has shifted away from the acceptance of anything from the invisible, and we therefore have to try to find a way to accommodate it. Now, this comes to a head in America in something called the fundamentalist modernist controversy. The 2 key things that happen, by the way, intellectually are, first of all, we've got to get rid of the idea of the creation. Because if there is a creation, then we've got to talk about a creator. So they return to the old Greek idea, which I mentioned first lecture, of an eternal universe. So if we've got an eternal universe, there's no need for a creator. How do you deal with human distinctives? Well, humans aren't really distinct. We've got Darwin to show that. We're just animals that have evolved in a particular direction. Okay? So once you got those things in place, you can effectively get rid of God. Okay? Darwin especially becomes an issue in America. And you get this fundamentalist modernist controversy really over Darwin. And long story short, the conservative view, the fundamentalist view, loses the propaganda war, and Darwinism and liberal Protestantism become mainstream. The fundamentalists pick up their marbles and go home and develop their own institutions and their own subculture and all of that, and don't interact with anybody. And so from that point on, what you see is what I would describe as the golden age of liberal Protestantism in America through the 50s. But by the late 50s, there are people like Carl Henry, and a little later Francis Schaeffer, who will come along and say, wait a minute, we shouldn't be doing this as fundamentalists. We need to engage in these debates. We need to re-enter the public world. And that is the rise of evangelicalism out of fundamentalism. Evangelicalism is going to, Billy Graham and people like that will be central figures here. It's going to become really significant with the election of Jimmy Carter, a self-professed evangelical, as president in 1976. And at this point, 1976 is declared by Time magazine to be the year of the evangelical. So at this point, we have evangelicalism has now entered mainstream culture. And at some points, there's something like 40% of the population of America define themselves as evangelical in surveys. The problem is, now I'm compressing a whole lot of things here because I'm looking at the clock and I've got 3 minutes.
You can go a little bit.
The problem with this is that fundamentalism became enamored, evangelicalism, I would argue, became enamored with its own success. We're in a place of cultural recognition, cultural prominence, we've got cultural influence, we want to keep it. And the net result is, as the culture changed in different ways, evangelicalism changed to accommodate it. And the net result is they lost the key distinctive. And that's that they forgot what Jesus says, that if the world hates you, remember they hated me first. They forgot what James said, friendship with the world is enmity with God. And the net result is they, like I said, I think evangelicals became addicted to popularity. And so you get megachurch movements, you get all kinds of things that follow from that are geared to cater to the lost and to maintain some sort of influence in the culture as the culture was increasingly turning away from the values and the core ideas of Christianity. Aaron Renn has this a thing that he calls the 3 eras of evangelicalism, where he talks about one period where he calls it the positive period, where being an evangelical or being a Christian was seen as being a good thing. You've got the neutral period, where it was seen as neutral, neither good nor bad. And a lot of key figures like Tim Keller and others were operating in a neutral world. But he says we've passed out of the neutral world now into a negative world, where Christianity is seen as a negative thing. Being a Christian is no longer in, it's no longer a legitimate option. In a lot of the culture, we're seen as the bad guys. Okay? And a lot of people are anxious about this. They're saying, well, how can we show that we're really not that? Well, we're back to the early church and the apologists, aren't we? We've got to clarify what Christianity is about and what it isn't about. We need to do that. But like the early church, in the face of opposition, we have to live lives of radical faithfulness. We don't win the culture over by becoming like the culture. We don't do that. We can't do that. What we have to do is to stand firmly on the truth, on biblical truth and biblical standards, without apology. We need to explain these. We need to help people understand them. We need to do all those things like the early apologists did, but it took them 300 years before Christianity was decriminalized. We need to be aware of the kind of world that we're in, the kind of culture we're facing, and we need to get a backbone and be unafraid in the face of it. Because we've all, I hope, read the last chapter in the Bible. We win. Okay. But we shouldn't expect, as Jesus said, we should not expect to be popular in this world. And that is, I would argue, the biggest problem in the church right now in America, that we're chasing after popularity, we're chasing after influence, we're trying to get people to like us. And that's not our job. Our job is to be faithful. The early church won because they lived lives of extravagant faithfulness without compromising the truth. That's what we need today. So there were a whole lot of other things I wanted to work into this, but I am now out of time. So that's it for now.